I paid for my daughter's house and her wedding, and the first thing she did when it was all over was look me in the eye and say, "You've done enough, Mom. It's time for you to find your own place." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just smiled, picked up my purse, and walked out the front door of the home I had paid for, the home I thought I'd grow old in, and the next morning, I called my lawyer. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. My name is Margaret Collins, I'm 67 years old, and I've spent most of my life doing what mothers are supposed to do. I worked, I saved, I sacrificed, and I gave everything I had to make sure my daughter, Emily, never had to struggle the way I did. I raised her alone after her father passed away when she was just 9. Back then, I was working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, cleaning offices at night and working the front desk at a small dental clinic during the day. There were weeks I barely slept, but I never complained. Because every time I looked at Emily, I told myself it would all be worth it someday. And for a long time, I believed it was. Emily grew up smart, kind, and driven. She got into a good college, graduated with honors, and landed a respectable job in marketing. When she met Jason, I'll admit, I was relieved. He seemed stable, polite, the kind of man who could give her the life I had always wanted for her. When they got engaged, Emily came to me one evening, her voice soft, almost hesitant, and she said, "Mom, we found a house. It's perfect, but we're just a little short on the down payment." I didn't even think twice. I told her I would take care of it. Not just the down payment, but the entire house. I had savings. Years of careful planning, cutting corners, saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to her. And the wedding? That was my gift to her too. A beautiful ceremony at a vineyard just outside the city, white roses, soft music, everything she had dreamed of. I remember standing there that day, watching her walk down the aisle, thinking to myself, this is it. This is what all those years were for. I thought I was gaining a son, not losing a daughter. After the wedding, Emily suggested I move in with them, just for a while. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom," she said. "Besides, you helped us get this place. It's your home too." I believed her. I packed up my things, sold the small house I had lived in for over 30 years, and moved into the guest room at the end of the hallway. At first, everything felt right. We had dinners together, laughed over small things, shared stories. But slowly, something shifted. It wasn't one big moment. It was small things. Quiet things. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Doors that were suddenly closed. Plans I wasn't included in. And then, one evening, after dinner, Emily set her fork down, looked at me with a calm expression I didn't recognize, and said the words that changed everything. The next morning, I woke up in a quiet hotel room that smelled faintly of coffee and fresh linen, the kind of place people stay in when they are passing through, not when they are starting over, and for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle around me, because it felt different from the silence in that house. This one was honest, it did not pretend to belong to anyone, it did not expect anything from me. And as I sat up slowly, I realized something that brought me a strange sense of clarity. I had walked away with less than I had given, but I had not walked away empty. I still had control over the one thing that mattered, the truth of what had been done, and the way it had been done, and that truth had weight, more than Emily or Jason seemed to understand. I made myself a cup of coffee using the small machine on the counter, measured the water carefully, poured it in, and waited as it brewed. The simple routine grounding me, reminding me that I was still steady, still capable, still the same woman who had built everything they were now taking for granted. And when I sat down by the window, I pulled out a folder from my bag, a folder I had not opened in months, not because it was unimportant, but because I had trusted that I would never need it. Inside were copies of every major financial decision I had made in the past 5 years, the bank transfers, the closing documents for the house, the wire confirmation for the wedding venue, every receipt, every signature, every line that proved exactly where the money had come from and whose name was attached to it. And as I flipped through the pages, slowly, carefully, I could feel that quiet shift inside me becoming something more defined, not anger. Not even sadness anymore, but focus, a kind of calm precision that only comes when there is nothing left to misunderstand. I remembered the day we signed the paperwork for the house, how Emily had been so excited, how Jason had shaken my hand and thanked me, and how the realtor had explained each document in detail, making sure we understood every clause, every ownership detail, every legal protection. At the time, I had not paid much attention to the specifics. I had trusted that what mattered was that my daughter would have a home, but now, those details mattered more than anything, because they told a story that Emily had either forgotten or chosen to ignore, and I reached for my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and paused when I saw the name I was looking for, Daniel Harris, the attorney who had handled my estate planning years ago, a careful man, precise. Someone who believed in writing things down properly so there would be no confusion later. I had not spoken to him in a long time, but I knew he would remember me, and more importantly, he would understand exactly what needed to be done. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the ring, steady and even, and when he answered, his voice calm and professional, I introduced myself, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in his tone, and I told him, simply, that I needed to review some documents regarding a property I had funded, that there had been a misunderstanding, and that I wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly, legally, and without unnecessary conflict. And as I spoke those words, I realized that I meant every part of them. This was not about creating a scene or proving a point. This was about restoring balance, about making sure that what I had built could not be quietly taken away from me under the assumption that I would accept it. And when he asked me to come into his office that afternoon, I agreed without hesitation, because for the first time since that dinner, I knew exactly what I was going to do next, and more importantly, I knew that I did not need to raise my voice to do it. Daniel Harris's office had not changed in the 10 years since I had last sat across from him. The same dark wood desk, the same neatly organized stacks of files, the same quiet atmosphere that made everything feel deliberate and permanent. And as I took a seat in front of him, placing my folder carefully on the desk, I noticed the way he observed me for a moment before speaking, not with curiosity, but with the kind of attention that comes from someone who understands that people do not come to him unless something important has shifted. And I told him everything without raising my voice, without adding emotion that did not need to be there, just the facts. I paid for the house, I funded the wedding, I moved in at my daughter's invitation, and now I had been asked to leave, and he listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally making a small note, and when I finished, he leaned back slightly and asked a question that seemed simple on the surface but carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Whose name is on the title? I paused for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I had not truly considered what that answer meant until now, and I told him the truth. The house had been purchased in my name, the funds had come directly from my account, and although I had intended it as a gift, there had never been a formal transfer of ownership completed after the purchase. I remember thinking at the time that there was no need to rush, that we were family, that there would always be time to handle those details later, and Daniel gave a small, measured nod as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he opened the folder I had brought, reviewing each document with a level of care that made the room feel even quieter, more focused, and as he flipped through the pages, I watched his expression remain steady, professional, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight straightening that told me he had reached the part that mattered. And when he finally looked up at me, his voice was calm, precise, and entirely certain. Margaret, based on these documents, you are the legal owner of that property. There is no ambiguity here, no shared ownership, no informal agreement that would override what is written. And for a brief moment, I simply let those words settle, not because they surprised me, but because hearing them spoken aloud gave them a weight that could not be ignored. And he continued, explaining that any assumption made by Emily or Jason about their control over the house was not supported by the legal reality, that my permission had been extended, not my ownership transferred, and that permission could be withdrawn, cleanly and within the bounds of the law. And I asked him what that would look like, not in theory, but in practice, and he explained the process step by step: a formal notice, a clear timeline, a requirement for them to vacate if I chose to reclaim the property, all handled professionally, without confrontation, without unnecessary conflict, just a correction of what had been misunderstood, or perhaps taken for granted. And I sat there listening, feeling that same quiet sense of control returning, not as something new, but as something I had always had and simply chosen not to exercise. And when he asked me how I wanted to proceed, I did not hesitate. I told him I wanted everything handled properly, documented, and delivered without emotion, because this was no longer about family dynamics or hurt feelings. It was about clarity, about making sure that the truth was not something that could be ignored or rewritten. And as he began drafting the necessary documents, I realized that for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next. Daniel told me the paperwork would be ready by the end of the day, and when I stepped out of his office into the late afternoon light, everything around me felt unusually clear, not brighter, not softer, just precise, as if the world had quietly shifted into focus now that I had finally seen things for what they were. And I did not rush back to the hotel. I walked slowly, taking in the steady rhythm of the city, people passing by, cars stopping at lights, conversations drifting in and out. All of it moving forward without hesitation, and I realized that was exactly what I was doing. 2. Moving forward, not away from something, but toward a version of myself I had set aside for too long. And later that evening, when Daniel emailed me the draft of the formal notice, I read every line carefully, not because I doubted him, but because I wanted to understand exactly what I was about to set in motion. It was clear, direct, and unemotional, a statement of ownership. A request for the occupants to vacate within a specified period, and a reminder that continued residence without permission would have legal consequences, nothing harsh, nothing excessive, just facts presented with the kind of certainty that does not invite argument. And I replied with a simple confirmation, giving him permission to proceed. And the next morning, while I sat in the same quiet hotel room with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, he sent it, officially, properly, with all the necessary documentation attached. And I imagined the moment it would arrive, the envelope being opened, the words being read, the shift in understanding that would follow, not because I wanted to picture their reaction, but because I knew it would come inevitably. And just after noon, my phone rang, Emily's name lighting up the screen in a way that felt almost unfamiliar now, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to meet that moment with the same calm she had shown me. Her voice came through tight, controlled, but underneath it I could hear something else, something less certain than before, asking what the notice meant, asking if there had been some mistake, and I listened without interrupting, letting her speak, letting her try to reshape the situation into something more comfortable, something that made sense to her. And when she finished, I spoke in the same steady tone I had used with Daniel, explaining that there was no mistake, that the house was legally mine, that the arrangement had always been temporary, and that I was simply formalizing what had already been made clear at that dinner table. And there was a pause on the other end, a long one, filled with the kind of silence that comes when expectations no longer match reality. And then she said my name, softer this time, as if trying to reach back to something that was no longer there. But I did not respond to that shift. I did not step back into the role she was reaching for, because this was no longer about comfort or familiarity. It was about truth. And I told her the timeline was outlined in the notice, that everything would be handled professionally, and that I expected the same in return. And when the call ended, I set the phone down beside me and looked out the window, not with satisfaction, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding that this was the moment everything had changed, not when she asked me to leave, but now, when I chose not to return in the way she expected. The silence after that call did not last long, because by early evening my phone began to ring again, not just once, but repeatedly, Emily first, then Jason, then Emily again, and I watched the screen light up each time without rushing to answer, letting the urgency on their side exist without immediately responding to it, because for the first time, I understood that urgency did not belong to me, it belonged to them. And when I finally did answer, It was not Emily's voice that greeted me, it was Jason's, sharper now, less controlled than before, asking what I thought I was doing, saying that sending a legal notice was unnecessary, that this could have been handled as a family matter, and I listened, the same way I had listened the night before, without interrupting, without reacting to the tone, because tone does not change facts, and when he finished, I told him, calmly, that I had already tried to handle it as a family matter, that the conversation had taken place at their dinner table, and that the decision to involve legal structure had not been made lightly, but it had been made clearly, and there was a pause on his end, a brief one, but enough to show that he had not expected that response, and then Emily came back on the line, her voice different now, softer again, but with an edge of something else, something that sounded like disbelief mixed with frustration, asking why I was making things so complicated, why I could not just talk to them, and I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but because I finally saw the pattern completely, the way the situation was being reframed as if I were the one creating difficulty, as if the request for me to leave had been simple, reasonable, something I should have accepted without question, and I told her that nothing about this was complicated, that the situation was very clear, that the house belonged to me, that they had asked me to leave, and that I was now asking them to do the same, and there was another silence, longer this time, and I could imagine them standing there, in the living room I had furnished, looking at each other, trying to decide what to say next, trying to find a version of this conversation that would return control to them, but there was none, not anymore, and when Emily spoke again, she asked if this was really how I wanted things to end, and I considered that question carefully. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to answer it truthfully, and I told her that this was not how I had wanted anything to happen, but it was how things had unfolded, and I was simply responding to that reality, not rewriting it, not pretending it was something else, and I reminded her that I had not raised my voice, I had not made accusations, I had not asked for explanations, I had accepted what she told me, and now I expected the same in return. And when the call ended this time, it did not feel abrupt or unfinished, it felt complete, like a conversation that had reached its natural conclusion, and in the days that followed, there were no more calls, only a few brief messages asking for clarification on timelines, on logistics, on what would happen next, all written in a tone that had shifted from confrontation to formality, and I responded the same way, clearly, directly, without adding anything unnecessary, and as I sat in that quiet room each evening, reviewing the next steps with Daniel, I realized that what had changed was not just the situation, but the way I was being addressed, the way I was being seen. No longer as someone whose presence could be managed or dismissed, but as someone whose decisions carried weight. And that shift, more than anything else, told me that I had done exactly what needed to be done. The timeline Daniel had outlined moved forward exactly as he said it would, not rushed, not delayed, just steady, each step documented, each communication clear, and a week after the notice had been delivered, he informed me that Emily and Jason had requested a formal meeting, not to contest the ownership, because there was nothing to contest, but to discuss their options, and I agreed to attend, not out of obligation, but because I wanted everything to remain transparent, and when I walked into Daniel's office that afternoon, I saw them sitting across from his desk, side by side, their posture different from the last time I had seen them, less certain, more restrained, and for a moment, there was an unfamiliar silence between us, not hostile, not emotional, just measured, as if we were all acknowledging that the roles we had once played no longer applied here. And Daniel began by reviewing the situation in precise terms, the ownership of the property, the timeline for vacating, the legal expectations moving forward, and neither Emily nor Jason interrupted, which told me more than anything they could have said, and when he finished, Emily spoke first, her voice controlled, but softer than before, asking if there was any possibility of an alternative arrangement, something that would allow them to remain in the house, at least temporarily, and I listened carefully, not to the words alone, but to the intention behind them, because this was not the same conversation as before. This was not a demand, it was a request, and I realized that the shift I had felt over the past few days was now fully visible, not just in how they spoke, but in what they were asking for, and I asked her what she meant by alternative, and she hesitated for a moment before explaining that moving out immediately would be difficult, that they had not prepared for it, that they needed time to figure out their next steps, and I nodded slowly, because I understood that, not as a mother, but as someone who had managed her life carefully for decades, and I told her that I was willing to allow a limited extension under specific conditions, all documented, all agreed upon formally, not because I was changing my decision, but because I was choosing how it would be carried out, and I saw something shift in her expression then, a brief flicker of relief, followed by something else, something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition, as if she was beginning to understand that this was no longer about what she wanted, but about what I allowed. And Jason spoke next, his tone more measured than it had been on the phone, agreeing to the terms Daniel outlined, asking a few practical questions about timelines and logistics, and as the conversation continued, it remained steady, professional, without raised voices or emotional appeals, just decisions being made and recorded, and when the meeting ended, we all stood at the same time, and for a moment, Emily looked at me as if she wanted to say something more. Something beyond the agreement we had just reached, but she did not. And I did not ask her to, because whatever needed to be said had already been made clear, not in words, but in actions, and as I left the office, stepping back into the quiet rhythm of the afternoon, I realized that this was not about winning or losing, it was about restoring something that had been taken for granted, and ensuring that it would not happen again, not to me, not in this way. The days that followed moved with a quiet, deliberate rhythm, each step unfolding exactly as it had been outlined, and I returned to the house only once during that time, not to reclaim it in a dramatic way, not to confront anyone, but simply to walk through it with clarity, to see it again not as a place filled with expectations, but as a property I had built, funded, and now chosen to take back, and when I stepped through the front door, everything looked the same, the furniture still in place, the light falling across the floors in the same familiar way, but the feeling had changed completely, the warmth I once associated with it was gone, replaced by something neutral, almost distant. As if the house itself had shed the illusion I had placed on it, and Emily was there, standing near the kitchen. Her posture careful, measured, and she greeted me without hostility, without warmth, just a simple acknowledgement that reflected the new reality between us, and I nodded in return, moving through the space slowly, noticing the details I had overlooked before, the way certain rooms had been rearranged, the way my presence had gradually been reduced even before I had been asked to leave. And I realized that this transition had not started at that dinner table, it had been happening quietly for some time. I had simply chosen not to see it, and as I walked into the living room, I paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This had been the place where I believed we were building something together, a shared future, but now it was clear that what I had built was never meant to be shared in the way I imagined, and I turned back toward the hallway, where a few of my remaining belongings had been neatly packed into boxes, ready to be removed, and I picked up one of them, feeling its weight in my hands, not heavy, but significant, because it represented something more than just objects. It marked the end of a version of my life that I no longer needed to hold on to, and Emily stepped forward slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but she stopped herself, and in that moment, I understood that whatever words she might have chosen would not change what had already been set in motion. And I did not ask for them, I did not create space for them, because silence, in this case, was more honest than anything we could say, and as I carried the box toward the door, I felt no urgency, no tension, just a steady sense of completion, and once everything that belonged to me was removed, I handed the keys to the property manager Daniel had arranged, ensuring that the final steps would be handled professionally, without unnecessary interaction, and when I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, I did not look back, not because I was trying to forget, but because there was nothing left there that required my attention. Everything that mattered had already been resolved. And as I walked to my car, I realized that what I had regained was not just the house, but something far more important, the understanding that what I give by choice, and what I keep with clarity, and that from this point forward, Nothing in my life would be built on assumptions that could so easily be taken away. The house was quiet the day everything was finalized, not empty in a physical sense, but settled, as if it had returned to its original state before expectations and assumptions had been layered onto it. And I stood in the living room one last time, not as someone reclaiming something lost, but as someone closing a chapter that had run its course. And the property manager had already confirmed that Emily and Jason had vacated according to the agreed timeline, everything left behind documented. Everything handled exactly as outlined, no conflict, no resistance, just a quiet exit that matched the quiet way this entire situation had unfolded. And I walked slowly through each room, not searching for anything, but acknowledging what had been there, the dinners we shared, the conversations that once felt genuine, the belief I had carried that this space represented something lasting between us. And I realized that while the house remained, the meaning I had attached to it no longer did. And that was not a loss, it was a correction, a necessary one. And when I reached the kitchen, I paused briefly, resting my hand on the counter, remembering the moment she had told me to leave, the calm in her voice, the certainty. And I felt no anger now, no lingering need to revisit that moment, because it had already served its purpose. It had shown me exactly where I stood, and more importantly, it had shown me what I needed to do next, and I turned away. Without hesitation, stepping back into the hallway, the space now clear, neutral, no longer holding any version of the life I had imagined, and later that afternoon, I met with Daniel one final time to confirm that everything had been completed, the documents filed, the transition of occupancy recorded, the property fully secured under my control once again, and as we reviewed the final details, he asked if there was anything further I wanted to pursue, any additional actions, and I told him no. Because there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to prove, everything that needed to be clarified had already been made clear, and when I left his office, I did not feel victorious. I felt steady, grounded in a way that had nothing to do with the outcome and everything to do with the decision to act when it mattered. And in the weeks that followed, there were no calls, no messages, no attempts to reopen what had already been closed. Just distance, quiet and complete, and I accepted that. Distance without trying to change it, because some things, once revealed, do not return to what they were, and should not. And as I settled into a new place, smaller, simpler, chosen entirely by me, I found that the absence of expectation created a different kind of peace, one that did not depend on anyone else's understanding or approval, and I began to rebuild my routine, my days structured around my own choices. My own priorities, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a continuation of who I had always been beneath it all. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I would think of Emily, not with resentment, but with a clarity that did not soften the truth. She had made her choice, and I had made mine, and those choices had led us here, not as a punishment, not as a lesson forced upon either of us, but as a natural result of actions taken without consideration for what they would cost. And I understood now that what I had given all those years had never been a guarantee of how I would be treated in return, but what I chose to keep, my dignity, my boundaries, my ability to step away without losing myself, that was something no one could take from me, and as I looked forward, not back, I carried that understanding with me, not as a burden, but as a foundation, steady, quiet, and entirely my own.